Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Ronit. I work on the SQL product team, building great security features for Microsoft SQL that help you secure your data and make your databases safer. And I'm here to talk to you today about data privacy, about GDPR, and about what built-in technologies we have in SQL that can help you address GDPR requirements. So let's lay out some kind of clear goals for this session. We'll start by talking about GDPR, what it is, and what it means to you. Could I have a quick show of hands who knows what the GDPR is? Oh, good. That's good. All right, so we won't spend too much time on that. And then who thinks that it applies to their organization? OK, so we get that. That's a good thing. All right. So we'll take that, we'll break it down a little bit into kind of some more concrete requirements. And then we'll focus on SQL technologies, the data tier, and kind of map out the requirements to various technologies in SQL that can help us meet those requirements. And specifically, we'll kind of focus more on some brand new technologies that we have in SQL that hopefully can help more. So what I really want you to take out of this session is a familiarity with these technologies that we have in SQL that can help you meet these requirements. So let's start with some motivation, okay, as if we needed any. It seems like every week we're hearing about a new major data breach. Okay, we had the Equifax breach that's already old news. There's another one about Deloitte from a couple of days ago. They are not disclosing how many records were affected because they're afraid to, but from Equifax, they were talking about on the order of 150 million personal records of their customers stolen. If we look at the kind of bigger picture, we're talking about around on the order of 2 billion records, 2 billion records of personal data compromised in the last year alone. And Equifax is not an exception in the fact that it took them several months to identify that this breach took place. Okay, that's very typical. And I think the long time that it takes speaks to the fact that these data attacks are becoming more sophisticated and they're getting much harder to track. And it unfortunately also speaks to the fact that it seems like a lot of organizations don't even have a detection mechanism in place. They're not even looking for these, even though it's happening all the time. And of course, if a data breach does occur, then it's going to cost you. There's actually an annual report that gets put out by the Ponemon Institute, an independent research organization, together with IBM Security, that's called the Cost of a Data Breach Report. And they actually analyze how much this data breach is going to cost you if it affects your organization, depending on all sorts of parameters. It's an interesting read, and the bottom line, I can kind of tell you how it ends. The cost is going up. Okay, so if that wasn't enough motivation for you, then let me try to convince you even more with some more sort of staggering statistics that hopefully will convince you. We talked about the huge number of records stolen. Break that down to a kind of a per day. We're talking about over 5.25 million records stolen every single day. What kind of data is being targeted by these attacks? Well, as it turns out, the idea of identity theft is really high up on that list. That's what most of the attackers are looking for, and as we see in 2017, by a really large margin. And then there's also financial information and other kind of interesting sensitive data that's being targeted. And if you were wondering if this trend really is kind of going up, so another kind of staggering number, a 40% increase in data breach incidents from 2015 to 2016, 40%. And it's no wonder that people really do feel like they've lost control of their personal data. And the next figure kind of gives that even more backing if you know that 64% of Americans have been affected by a major data breach. So if anyone is still not convinced, you can just walk out because it seems like data breaches are a big deal. This is Elizabeth Denham. She is the Information Commissioner in the UK, and she has the daunting task of trying to deal with this at a government level, at an administrative level. And she kind of speaks to the unfortunate issue of the lack of trust that people have in organizations to really protect the data that they give them. And it's kind of very clear to her and basically across the globe to anyone dealing with regulations that something needs to be done to ensure that people can do business with organizations without fear of their data being compromised. So that brings us to basically the reaction in the regulatory world. So data privacy regulation is not new. It's been around for a while. The European Union has actually been a world leader in this area. They had a data protection directive in place since 1995, which was kind of an overarching directive, but not a law, and different EU states implemented it, but each implemented it a little bit differently. Now, there are also data protection and data privacy regulations in individual industries. So we know that in the financial industry, we have PCI, DSS, and others. Healthcare has HIPAA, so there are regulations there. But again, it seems pretty clear based on the dire state of affairs with these data breaches that what's in place now is not enough. And so there has been a lot of activity in this area in kind of the past couple of years and recently. Now, in the United States, there is no overarching data protection regulation. This is actually in the control of individual states. And we see that there's been a lot of activity in this area lately, and it speaks to that no less than 41 states have actually introduced or made some sort of change in some sort of data privacy regulation in 2017 alone, so far. And 48 of the US states have some sort of regulation that talks about notifying about a data breach. Now, in Asia as well, they're facing this and they're dealing with this. So, and they tend to focus on the problem of online privacy and consent for processing data and those elements. So China just introduced a new law earlier this year, the China Cybersecurity Law, that deals with consent and that deals with those issues. India also has vowed to implement a data protection law that will be significant and will kind of change the game. In Japan also, there's a new information commission, or data protection commission, that deals with the handling of personal data. So a lot of activity around the world, but the real culmination here is the EU GDPR, which really is a game changer in this world of regulation. And the reason for that is, first of all, because it's much more stringent in terms of what it requires than anything that came before it, because it has far-reaching geographical effect in terms of the organizations that it affects, and because of the strict penalties that it introduces. And so we'll focus a little bit more on the GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation. We'll go through this quickly. I understand that most people know what this is about, but this is a new European privacy law, basically a 261-page legal document that defines what rights consumers have in the handling of their personal data and defines obligations on organizations to enable these rights and to protect that data. So this replaces that EU data directive from 1995. It's actually the first major legislation since then. Only it's significantly more ambitious. It gives individuals a lot more control over their personal data, and it imposes obligations on organizations that collect or handle or analyze personal data. And the interesting thing is that it affects not only organizations, European organizations or organizations in Europe, it affects any organization that does business with Europe or manages data of any EU citizen. So any global organization that handles anything about EU citizens is affected. So this will go into effect in May of 2018, May 25th of 2018, and it's going to require significant investments from Microsoft and from many organizations across the globe. And people are going to have to really change the way they deal with handling personal data, protecting personal data, and creating processes for how consent is obtained and other elements. And we'll go into those in more detail. So before we talk about all these kind of heavy investments that need to be made and this big headache for organizations and how much we have to do to change data governance and data protection, we have to remember what the GDPR really is about. And that is about protecting our customers' personal data, about protecting our personal data. And why should you, the organization, care? Well, because protecting your customer data is important. And because your organization's business and your reputation is at stake. And in the case of GDPR, because you'll get fined very heavily if you don't comply. So let's take a look at sort of the key changes that we have with the GDPR and what those mean to you. So some of these changes have to do more with kind of technological changes that we need to make, and some are more sort of process related. So the first sort of set talks about the rights around personal privacy. So the GDPR lays out that individuals have the right to have access to all of the personal data that you have about them. Okay, they have the right to access it and get a copy of it. They have a right to request that it be erased. This is the famous right to be forgotten clause. If a user requests that you forget them, you need to be able to erase all the pieces of data that you have that are related to that individual. They have a right to object to processing at any given time. So you have to have kind of a stop button that says if they object to processing, then you need to stop processing any data related to that individual. And they have a right also to have their data exported into sort of common format if they want to, for example, move from one vendor to another and take their entire data set with them. So that's the rights that individuals have, and now there are a set of obligations on organizations beyond enabling these rights for individuals. Then organizations need to protect the data that they are processing with appropriate security measures. Okay, and the GDPR talks a little bit about what those appropriate security measures are. It also talks specifically about notifying in the case of a data breach, and it defines a window of 72 hours within which you have to notify if a data breach occurs. Okay, not like Equifax talking about 6 months later, 72 hours. There's also a clause talking about getting consent for processing. So you have to receive consent for processing any individual's personal data. And there is a specific requirement talking about records of data processing. Okay, so whatever processing you're doing on individuals' data, you need to have records, and part of this is for kind of evidence of compliance. So then there's more sort of the policies aspect. What kind of policies you have? I just mentioned really quickly that we'll keep questions till the end because that's kind of the, okay. So from a policies aspect, then one of the things you need to do is provide clear notice that you're collecting individuals' data. So the customer, the consumer needs to know that you're collecting their data, and they also need to understand what kind of processing you're doing. So it's also talking about actually explaining, kind of providing information on exactly what you need the data for and what processing you're doing on that data. And it talks also about data retention and data deletion policies that you need to have. And finally, in the last sort of section talks about IT and training, talking about kind of more the people working for your organization and what kind of training they need to have. So there are requirements around training employees in privacy and having them understand what's going on here. There's talking about being able to audit and update policies in your organization. And there's a specific role that the GDPR calls out called a DPO, a data protection officer, which is actually a person that certain companies of a certain size need to actually employ such a data protection officer that will kind of make sure that you're properly complying. And there's also an element of vendor contracts, okay? So if you're sharing data between other vendors in what you're doing, then there have to be sort of compliant contracts based on what the GDPR defines. So we're going to take those kind of key changes and focus specifically on the sort of data protection elements of the GDPR. As we're focusing sort of on the data tier, then these are the specific kind of GDPR requirements that we want to focus on. And we'll look at some specific GDPR articles, okay, and what they call out in terms of data protection. So starting with Article 25, this calls for what the GDPR calls data protection by design and by default. That means you need to have data protection mechanisms like access control and minimization built in to your product as you're building it, as part of its design. Then there's the article that talks about security of processing. Okay, so this is adding all sorts of security controls. It talks about things like encryption, things like pseudonymization, so kind of obfuscating data, and it talks about keeping records of processing as well. And then we have another specific Article 30 that actually specifically talks of keeping records of processing activities. So this is kind of a matter of auditing, what type of activities are taking place on your data. Going back to Article 33, this is the one that specifically talks about notification of a data breach. So this is what we mentioned before about the 72-hour window. If your data is breached, and you pretty much need to assume breach based on what we saw earlier, because that's what's happening today, then you have to be able to detect that. You have to be able to assess the impact, and you have to have a way to respond and notify again within that window. And finally, there's an article that talks about what they call a data protection impact assessment. So this is basically documentation of what risks you have within your system and what security measures you're implementing in order to mitigate those risks. Okay, so this is an overview of sort of the data protection, specific data protection items, or a summary of those in the GDPR. Now, needless to say, in order to meet GDPR compliance, you'll have to meet all of the requirements that it lays out across your entire application stack and be able to meet all the process requirements and the technical requirements wherever the data flows in your organization. But given that the database tends to be sort of at the core of the organization in terms of where the sensitive data, the customer records are stored, then clearly protecting data well at this level is going to be very important. And specifically looking at sort of the elements of data protection and data management at the database level. So Microsoft is taking the GDPR very seriously. We've committed to be compliant by May of 2018. And beyond that, we're also committed to help our customers, as we know that the compliance process can be pretty tricky, and we're doing what we can to help customers in their sort of journey to compliance. And there have been investments made across the company to enable that. So one of the things that we've looked at in terms of how we can help customers is to actually help start thinking about how do you approach compliance with the GDPR. And if you look at the Microsoft sort of GDPR Central site, which is at microsoft.com/GDPR, you can actually find an assessment that you can take to kind of assess the status of your environment and understand where you are in terms of GDPR compliance. And basically that assessment boils down to sort of a set of questions that you should ask yourself in order to start the process. Okay, so the first question is, do you know what sensitive personal data as defined by the GDPR you have in your system, and do you know where it is? And then you should ask yourself, okay, well, do you know then what access there is to that data, and do you have methods in place to control that access, or mechanisms that you can use to control that access? You then ask yourself, okay, do you have some protection mechanism for that sensitive data? Do you have policies that you can apply to protect the data? Okay? And then specifically for the item of data breaches, do you have a detection mechanism in place to be able to detect if a data breach occurs? Do you have a mechanism in place to assess the impact of that data breach and a method to notify it about it if it takes place? Because if you don't have that now, then it's going to be a lot of scrambling within those 72 hours. And finally, do you have a way to sort of regularly test your security and data protection status and have a document of that, as that's going to be important to document internally, and it's going to be important as evidence of compliance. So we've taken those sort of basic questions, and Microsoft has tried to make this sort of framework for, okay, here is your kind of phased process to approach compliance with the GDPR. And broke down the phases kind of aligned with the questions that we just asked for how do you reach kind of the compliance state. And you start with this discover phase where you're discovering what your sensitive data is, where it is, who has access, followed by the manage phase where you're managing and you have mechanisms in place to control access to the data, followed by the protect phase where you actually implement those security mechanisms to protect the data. You also implement the detection of breaches and the logging of activities and so on, and a mechanism also to assess and notify about breaches. And finally, the report phase where you're able to regularly sort of test the status of your system from the kind of GDPR compliance perspective. You're able to get reports on that, and you're able to submit those when needed. Okay, so this is kind of the framework this is how we think, Microsoft thinks about it, this is how Microsoft is approaching it, and this is how we're recommending that customers approach the sort of process. And now we'll take this process and break it down into, okay, how does this apply to the data tier, to your databases and your data warehouses, and kind of break down the process for each of these phases. And then we'll take a look at technologies that are built into Microsoft SQL products and services that can help you with each one of these phases, including existing capabilities and products and including new capabilities. So let's go into each one of these in some more detail. We start with the discover phase, right? So this is the phase where you're identifying personal data, you're inventorying. That's going to be part of the process here, to inventory what personal data you have, and also discover who has access. What is the access model to that data in terms of, when you're talking about databases, you're talking about understanding what the permissions model is, but you're also talking about access vectors that have to do with sort of the surface area of your database. Okay, as these can be ways that your data can be accessed that you don't necessarily think about. So our recommendation here is really to adhere to the best practice of the principle of least privilege, to make sure that the permissions model gives permissions only, exactly the permissions that each person needs to do their job, and not more than that. Okay, and that's going to be critical to kind of minimize the surface area and the risk involved here. And speaking of surface area beyond the permissions, also if there are any sort of open surface areas on your database, that could be ways that the data could be accessed, or access vectors or attack vectors, then try to minimize those as well. So an example here would be database features that you might have enabled that aren't really required by your application, but you're not really paying attention that they're enabled, and they can be attack vectors. Examples of this in SQL are XP command shell, which can be a very dangerous feature, CLR, OLE automation, and others. So there's a whole set of sort of best practices to minimize what's enabled if you don't absolutely need it. Now, in terms of technologies that can help with these sort of processes, then, okay, to discover sensitive data, ultimately you could use, this is a relational database system, you can use T-SQL queries to query for sensitive data. And we also have full text search capability in SQL that enables you to run kind of more complex queries and look for sensitive data with that. But what we're doing now is we're thinking about how we can actually make this process easier for you. And we're investing in technology that does automated data classification. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is something that's in active development and something that will be able to automatically discover and classify your sensitive data, and then keep that classification persisted to that data. And for the element of discovering what the surface area is and discovering what the permissions are, then we also have a new capability called a SQL vulnerability assessment. So This is something that really will enable you to sort of review what the permissions are, review what the surface area is, and give you a report about that, and enable you to improve the state. And we'll talk a lot more about SQL vulnerability assessment in a couple minutes. So that brings us to the manage phase. Manage really, talks about, if we're talking about databases, it really talks about access, right? How access is managed, what mechanisms you have in place, not just kind of knowing what the permissions model is, but what mechanisms you have in place to limit access. So in SQL, we have the kind of authentication and authorization mechanisms that we support. SQL supports SQL Server, SQL authentication with usernames and passwords. That's supported both in SQL Server and in Azure SQL Database, and also for Data Warehouse. But we also support integrated authentication with Windows for SQL Server and with Azure Active Directory in Azure. So rather than maintaining a separate sort of identity management for SQL users, you can just integrate directly with Windows authentication or Azure AD authentication, and this is definitely the recommended approach. Okay, we highly recommend as a best practice that you use those methods. For one thing, because you're automatically getting the sort of security built in to these authentication mechanisms. And for another thing, it's just generally a better practice to manage all of your identities in one place rather than in separate places. Another access limitation mechanism is the firewall in Azure SQL Database. So what you can do there is really limit the access to which applications can access your database based on their IPs. And it's very simple to configure in the Azure portal. You just kind of list the ranges of IPs that can access your database, and then all others are blocked. And we actually have a new capability here also that we've been talking about this week at Ignite called service endpoints, which can actually enable you to enable VNet subnets and only those to connect, and then you don't need to let all Azure services be able to connect to your database within Azure. Finally, in the access area, there are mechanisms in SQL that enable you to create policies based on the sort of data itself to manage authorization. So an example is you might have an application where certain rows should only be accessed by certain people. So you can think about an application, for example, maybe like a healthcare application where nurses need to access only the information on patients that they are working with. So what we have built into SQL is something called row-level security, where you can actually define a policy within the database that says who can access, or based on a predicate that you define, who can access which rows. And then the queries themselves don't even need to change. It's the same, the application stays the same, and automatically based on your RLS, row-level security policy, only the relevant rows would be returned to the relevant person. So that's one great capability for kind of limiting access. Another one is dynamic data masking. So this does something similar only at the column level. Here, if you have a particular column or field in your database that contains some piece of sensitive data, say an email address or a phone number, and you have lots of applications maybe connecting to the database, and they don't really need to see that email address in kind of full text. So you can define a policy, a dynamic data masking policy, or a mask on that element, and then anytime it's queried, it'll come back masked. It'll come back obfuscated. So either it'll be entirely masked out, or you can actually leave some of it visible, like a few characters of it visible, if you have that requirement. And that can be a great mechanism also to kind of limit accessibility to certain pieces of data. And dynamic data masking, by the way, is very, very easy to enable, especially in Azure SQL Database, where all you need to do is kind of select the field that's sensitive, select the mask that you want to apply, whether a full mask or sort of a partial mask, and you're done. And then from that point on, that data comes back masked. So that brings us to the protect phase. What do we have in Microsoft SQL technologies that can help with protecting your data? So here we talk about kind of built-in security mechanisms such as encryption. For a database environment, you want to have encryption at rest, in motion, and use, and the technologies are all available kind of built into SQL. You have transparent data encryption for protection of data at rest, which is on the physical disk itself. And this, by the way, tends to be a requirement of many kind of compliance policies beyond GDPR. We also have TLS, which is the secure protocol, and always encrypted, which is an industry-first encryption feature in SQL that enables client-side encryption where, for especially sensitive data that should never be revealed to the server. Never be revealed to the server means that anyone connecting to the server, including the database administrator, don't have access to that data, to that particular field of data. So this is also kind of column-based. And the only one with the keys to decrypt is the client that actually needs that data to do its work. And so the client has a transparent driver that decrypts and encrypts the data when it's en route to the server, and the client is the only one that sees that particularly sensitive data. The server never sees it. Additional elements of protection here. So there's the element of maintaining records and auditing database activities. So here within SQL, we have SQL Server Audit that you can enable. You can define granular audits and audit every activity that's taking place in your database. And in Azure SQL Database and Data Warehouse, we have Azure Auditing, which also is very, very simple to enable. You just kind of turn it on, tell it where to store the audit logs, and now all your database activities are being audited. The next element of protection is that element of detecting data breaches. And for this, we also have a built-in mechanism within SQL. This is for Azure SQL Database and Data Warehouse. We have our threat detection capability. So threat detection basically monitors all the activities taking place on your database and is able to recognize anomalous activities or patterns of attacks that could be suspicious and could indicate an attack on your database. And if it finds something like that that's suspicious, it will automatically notify you. It will send you an email with information on what exactly the suspicious activity was, how to kind of investigate it, and recommendations for what to do to lock it down. So if we're looking at the GDPR requirement of detecting data breaches and reporting about data breaches, that's going to be very helpful. And finally, another element of protection is ensuring business continuity. So the element of business continuity and high availability is also an important element of kind of protecting your customers' data. And here within the SQL technologies, we have always-on technology in SQL Server and active geo-replication in Azure SQL Database, which are kind of top-notch business continuity solutions to ensure the continuity of your data. So the last phase of the compliance process is the report phase. So this is where you really need to have kind of reports on what kind of activities are taking place on the data and on what your security measures are and what mitigations are in place. So when we're looking at the element of up-to-date records, then again, we can look at auditing. Auditing we talked about before and kind of tracks all of your database activities and keeps audit logs, and you have these records of what database activities took place. We also have temporal tables that are available that can help you track snapshots of the state of your data at certain points in time. And this, too, can be kind of a useful element for the reporting phase. Now, again, beyond kind of monitoring database activities, you also have to be able to have these sort of assessments in place to test what risks exist in your database and what measures there are to mitigate them. And this is where this new vulnerability assessment solution can come in and can really help. And what it does is basically gives you a comprehensive report on the security status of your database. And it also includes recommendations for how to improve the security of your database. So this is a brand new thing. It's actually one of the major investments that we're making in SQL to help with exactly these elements of GDPR and data privacy. And again, we're reiterating the commitment that Microsoft has not only to being compliant itself, but also to help customers in their compliance efforts by sharing kind of our experiences and how we're complying, and also by making investments, and that leads us sort of to the investments that Microsoft is making in terms of technical innovations as well, and this is happening across the company, including in the SQL organization, to really help customers along the lines of the efforts in GDPR compliance. So there are several developments that we're working on, and SQL vulnerability assessment is one of the major ones, and this can really help with the entire process that we talk about related to GDPR compliance. So that gives me the opportunity for probably the third or fourth time this week to proudly introduce this new capability, SQL Vulnerability Assessment, which is now available for public preview as of this week. And SQL Vulnerability Assessment is there to kind of improve the security of your database environment, both for Azure SQL Database and for on-premise SQL Server. So this is a hybrid release. So what is this vulnerability assessment? This is basically a centralized sort of dashboard for your SQL security needs. What it basically does is run a scan, a database scan, checking for a set of configurations and security best practices that are important to maintain the security of your database. And the result of that scan is basically visibility into your security state. So you can view potential security issues, get kind of a detailed explanation for each of the issues found, and it also offers a sort of remediation for every one of the issues that it finds. A remediation in terms of explaining how to remediate the issue, and also kind of an automatic action you can take, like a script that you can run, or a link that you can click to help you remediate the issue. And that's an integral part of the vulnerability assessment experience. In addition, this enables you to set up sort of a security baseline for your environment so that the report is ultimately customized to your security needs in your database environment. And that means that the assessment won't notify about issues that you have set as your baseline, and you can focus on the real sort of security issues and not have to deal with false positives. And finally, what the result here is really kind of a report which provides you with documentation on what the status is of potential security issues in your environment and what the status is of the security measures. And this report can be used to help kind of pass internal or external audits, and can be used to help along the process of meeting GDPR. A little bit about what the assessment is looking for. So first of all, we're checking for clear security best practices that ensure that your database is locked down as best as it can be. So an example is the separation of duties principle is applied, making sure that, again, you have kind of roles defined for each activity that needs to be taken in your application, and only users that need to have certain permissions have those permissions, and not excessive permissions. Also, the best practices talk about encryption being enabled, about auditing being enabled, again, kind of a best practice recommendation, and one that's necessary for compliance and for having a secure state. Looking at issues like firewall. So all the issues we talked about before that are helpful and required for doing good security and data privacy and GDPR, this is kind of recommending here. In addition, the vulnerability assessment lets you track the permissions in your system. So basically what you do is kind of set up a baseline for what the permissions really should be. And again, you adhere to the principle of least privilege. The permissions are only the minimum permissions needed. You set a baseline for that state, and then vulnerability assessment will let you track that over time. So as long as the permissions are matching the baseline that you set, then you're all good. As soon as there is some deviation there, then the vulnerability assessment, or VA, I'm going to call it VA from now on, will kind of call that out and notify you that some change has been made in your permissions, and then you can kind of check why that's the case and mitigate if necessary. And finally, VA has an element of identifying and classifying sensitive data. So one of the elements of the scan is basically searching for potentially sensitive data and creating an inventory of that data, along with a basic classification that we do on that data. And that enables you to sort of have track what sensitive data you have in the system, and we also provide kind of recommendations for how to protect it. So what we have today in vulnerability assessment is the basis for a more sophisticated data classification solution that's also in active development. So when we look at all these things, we can actually think about how vulnerability assessment, or VA, can really be relevant to all four of those kind of track to compliance phases that we talked about before, right? So it's helping you kind of discover both sensitive data and permissions and access to that data. It's helping you manage it by detecting kind of changes in permissions or detecting changes in surface area exposure. It's helping with the protection element by actually offering you sort of actionable protection mechanisms that you can apply. And of course, it provides a report, which helps with their reporting phase. So I'll show you a demo in a moment of what vulnerability assessment actually looks like and how it can help with all those things. But just quickly, we'll walk through sort of the steps so that we can follow what we're seeing. So you start with VA by running a scan on your database. In Azure SQL Database, vulnerability assessment is built into the service. So it's kind of part of the SQL Database service itself. For an on-premise SQL Server, we're actually including a new option in SQL Server Management Studio, in SSMS, that enables you to run a scan directly from there. Once that scan completes, what you get is a report basically showing what your assessment is and security state is on that database. And then you can kind of drill down into all of the results on that report, into issues that were found, and VA will provide a detailed explanation of what the problem is, why it's a security issue, and will also provide actionable remediation information for how to resolve that issue. And again, oftentimes it's something you can kind of click to run a script or click to open a link. There's the element of customizing to your environment, so you can set a baseline for the security issues that really are important to your environment, and then from that point on, VA will only call out and notify you about the deviations, basically, from your baseline state. So with that, let's jump into a quick demo here of VA. So this is our Azure portal, for anyone not familiar. And what we have here is kind of a database, an Azure SQL database that I have here. And I can see that under the settings for that database, I have a new option here called vulnerability assessment. So clicking here, what I would do kind of the first time that I'd come in here is that I would actually click on scan to scan my database for vulnerabilities. And I also need to set up sort of a storage for where those scan results are saved. So the scan results are saved on your storage account, which means that you have control of what you're doing with those results. So once that scan completes, then this report basically comes up, and it gives us sort of an overview of what the security state is in the database, showing how many checks were run, how many failed, and these are the issues that we have to deal with, and breaking those down in terms of the risk involved, so that you have kind of an overview of what risk currently exists on your database from a security perspective. And then we immediately can come down and kind of take focus on the issues that were found and what actions we should take to improve the security, and these are going to be sorted from sort of the higher risk items to the lower risk ones, where you really want to kind of focus your attention on the top ones first. We also have an element here of kind of categories, and these are categories of the different checks that the vulnerability assessment is running. So we have kind of 4 different categories, and if you're interested in focusing on one or more of them, then you can kind of filter according to that. So these are the sort of issues that were found. These are the failed results from the assessment. That means that these were the issues that were found on my database. We can also take a look at the passing checks. So basically, you have here information about all the checks that we're running. And so you know exactly what this assessment is looking for. But the failed tab really is kind of your focus area for improving security and for what you can do here. So we see some of the issues that were found here, and then this is sort of the overview, and then we can kind of click through to drill down and understand the issue with more depth. So if we look at sort of the first one, then we can click here, and we have sort of a details blade that talks about, okay, this check is looking for what SQL users or principals are members of high-impact database roles. So these are database roles that have very extensive permissions on the database, and you really want to have a minimal number of users have those extensive permissions. And so the sort of best practice principle is you should minimize the principals that are members of these roles, and we kind of explain what we're checking there, and we're explaining why that's important from a security perspective in terms of keeping with the kind of principle of least privilege and so on. And then down here, you actually have the results themselves that were found in your database. So in my database here, we see that these 3 principals all have these kind of high, they're members of this very high privileged role that's the DDL admin, and that can be a risk to the security of my database. And then below, we actually have the information on how to remediate. So remediating from our perspective is saying, okay, you should really remove any members of this high impact database role that don't absolutely need to have that access. So you should think about who really needs to have that access and remove anyone that doesn't. So the remediation script talks about just dropping those members from those roles, right? Saying, okay, that's how you minimize. And if I just want to actually apply this, then I can just kind of click here to run this directly within the Azure portal experience in the query editor. So the query editor requires us to log in, which is good. We can't make changes on the database without logging in. And let's say we actually do want to remediate this because we realize that although it's okay that Charlie is a member of this very high impact fixed database role, but these 2 guys don't really need to be. So let's just kind of click run. And that query succeeded, so now those should no longer be members of that role. And I'm done. I've now locked down my this particular element of members of roles to only those that really need it. So SQL, the vulnerability assessment is not going to show that result yet. We have to scan again in order to see that show up, but we'll see that in our next scan. Another item that we see here talks about enabling threat detection. So we talked earlier about threat detection, which is something that automatically kind of detects anomalous activities on your database and notifies you if there's something suspicious and if there could potentially be an attack on your database. And this goes together with auditing, by the way, too. So we see that we also don't have auditing enabled here, and we also have a recommendation to enable auditing. If I click through here, then again, I see the information about why threat detection is important, why it's important to my security, information about what the actual value is. So if the value in this case is false, threat detection is not enabled, we're recommending that it be true. And here we have kind of a click where I can just kind of click, open up the configuration blade for both auditing and threat detection, and enable these sort of directly as part of the experience. So auditing and threat detection are very, very simple to enable in Azure SQL Database. We just have to click on here, tell it which storage to write audit logs to, so I already have the storage here configured. And threat detection, I can just click on as well and make sure it's sending emails to all our co-administrators if there is an attack. I save this, and at that point I'm done. I now have auditing and threat detection enabled on this database. okay, great. So I've already resolved a couple of issues. And again, the idea with vulnerability assessment is to kind of go through and resolve all the issues and set this according to what your security state should be. One other thing that I wanted to show you here is that we have a rule that says that all memberships of user-defined roles should be intended. So what does that mean? That's saying, okay, you've defined a couple of a role here, okay, with this name, and you should make sure that you know who is members of that role. So this may be what you intended. You may have intended that these two users be members of this role, but you may have not. You should review this and set your baseline accordingly so that we'll know to notify you if something changes here. So basically I'm saying, okay, yeah, this is right. These two should be members of this role, and then I can approve this as my baseline. And what that means is that next time VA checks, it's not going to notify me about that anymore unless it changes. So let's run another scan. So now we have these baseline changes. We have the issues that we fixed. We'll run another scan. The scan takes only a few seconds, and it doesn't make any changes on your database. It just runs a set of queries, so it's very safe. And so now we see a new result. We see that we have less issues come up. That's great. Threat detection and auditing are enabled, so they don't show up here anymore. Those memberships were intended, so that doesn't show up here anymore. This one that we kind of resolved still shows up, but why does that show up? Well, because there still is a member here of the highly powerful role of DDL admin. And so I removed the ones that don't need to be, but this one does need to be. So again, this is something that I should set as my baseline and say, yeah, this is right for my environment. I'm going to set this as my baseline, so don't notify me about it unless it changes. We'll approve that. And then again, in the next scan, then we should not see this here as a failed result anymore. We should now focus only on the real issues, and that should fail only if there's a change in those memberships. So that the scan sometimes takes a few more seconds than others. But so now we see that that particular kind of finding disappeared. And if we go over here to the past tab, then we see that we do have kind of the things that we set as baseline. We actually notify you, okay, these are passing, but they're passing because you set them as your baseline for your state. So if we go into this kind of members of high impact roles, then we see that, yeah, this principal still is a member of this high impact role, but this is in your baseline, and that's why it's passing, and that's why it's okay. One more thing to show here with that is that if I do now go back and add, you know, I'm now kind of the malicious user who actually wants to add those other two users back to that high impact role because I want to do something malicious on the database. Then the idea here is that when we run a scan here again, that VA should again call that out and say, hey, something's changed here. This no longer matches your baseline, right? There it is. And why does it no longer match your baseline? Because Charlie is okay as a member of this role, but these two guys, you said they weren't part of your baseline. Okay? So that's kind of the power of being able to track deviations, track things that change, and that's very important for database security. So we just saw how vulnerability assessment works in the Azure portal on your Azure SQL database, but I promised you that it can also work for an on-prem SQL server. So vulnerability assessment also supports SQL Server 2012 and up, and it does that by having a new option in SSMS to run a vulnerability scan. So this is actually currently in limited preview. It's kind of an invitation-only preview. If you're interested, then please do talk to me later, and we can get you set up as but this will be released more widely in an upcoming release of SSMS. And I wanted to show you what that will look like, or what that looks like. So here's my SSMS. Here I have an on-premise SQL Server. This is SQL Server 2016 still. I haven't upgraded quite yet to 2017, but I'll do that soon. And what I have here basically is one of my databases is the sample database wide world importers. If I right-click on that, I can just go to tasks, and I have a new task here called scan for vulnerabilities. I do that. Here again, I tell it kind of where to save the result file. And within a few short seconds, again, I have an assessment report on the vulnerabilities on that database. The same kind of concept that we saw in the Azure portal. We have the failed tab and the pass tab. We have kind of the overview at the top. And note that the checks that are being run here on SQL Server are going to be a little different than what's running on Azure SQL Database. So for example, on Azure SQL Database, you can't enable remote admin connections. So that's not something we check for in Azure SQL Database, but we do check for it on SQL Server. And then again, we can kind of click through, look at the details down here for a particular check, the description of the check, the description of the security impact, and once again, the sort of remediation, including a script that you can then open directly in your query editor within SSMS. Okay? So as I said, that's available currently in limited preview, but you'll see it appear with wide distribution in an upcoming version of SSMS. So when we talked about the phases and the phases to compliance with GDPR, then the initial phase we talked about the discover phase, where we're looking for where our sensitive data is, as well as the access. And we said that vulnerability assessment can help here as well because it has an element of data classification. And so that's the one more demo I wanted to show you is what vulnerability assessment can do by way of discovering sensitive data on your database. So that's actually one of the rules here or checks here of the scan is looking for sensitive data columns. And if we click here, then again, it kind of explains to us that the purpose of this check is to really kind of automatically discover potentially sensitive columns within your database. This gives you the ability to track what sensitive data is there, so you have an inventory, and if you baseline what you have and a new piece of sensitive data somehow makes its way into your database, then you can get notified about that. And this is also actionable in the sense that we kind of give a recommendation for how to protect that sensitive data. So we can see kind of a number of fields that were discovered here by the sensitive data check, and they're also classified in kind of a simple way according to a certain data category. So things like names, email addresses, phone numbers, which belong to the personal data category. Of course, these are things that are relevant for the GDPR. We also have some sort of account information and tax information that was classified as financial data. Okay, and the idea here is that we also have a status saying, okay, is this piece of sensitive data protected? And the remediation here is to protect it using built-in mechanisms that we have in SQL to protect data. So, for example, if I know that I have a email address and phone number here that don't need to appear in plain text in the application, and I want to protect them using dynamic data masking, then if I just click here, then this brings me automatically to that experience within the Azure portal. Here, too, we have an experience of kind of looking for potentially sensitive data that requires masking, so we'll see some intersection here with what we found in the data discovery and what we're finding here. And here, if we want to mask the email address and phone number, all we need to do is click on Add Mask. These will be masked with kind of a full mask, a default value, click Save, and we're done. Now, what vulnerability assessment gives us at this point, once we scan again, that will basically be sort of the element of protection status, okay, on those sensitive fields. So until we basically baseline all of the sensitive data that we found, this is still going to show up as a finding, right, as a failing test. But we do have this sort of protection status here that changes if we have some security mechanism applied. Okay? So what we just saw is the sort of basis for a more sophisticated, automated kind of data discovery and data classification solution that's currently in active development, and we have kind of a more sophisticated solution that's in, again, a sort of limited preview. And the idea here is really that this element of data discovery is a very important element of GDPR and of the whole data privacy story. And what we're doing is investing in really trying to automate that process as much as possible, create a classification. We can also have like much more sophisticated classification than what we have so far, including giving you an ability to kind of input what is actually classified as sensitive in your system, input the classification. You could customize it, and the whole kind of experience could then be used to help with the true inventorying of your sensitive data for GDPR. Another element here is really being able to track that data throughout systems. So another element that we're working on here is to actually persistently tag or label that sensitive data within the SQL database, and that tag would then persist even if the data leaves the borders of the database. So if an application gets that data, then it will automatically be able to know based on that tag that it's received sensitive data, and it can then label it or classify the document appropriately. So again, this is something that is in active development. We currently have a limited preview, and including the ability you saw in VA. So that pretty much summarizes what we wanted to talk about. We went through the GDPR and other kind of data privacy regulations and initiatives. We focused on the data protection elements and hopefully broke those down into some requirements that we can think about in terms of how we approach compliance based on those requirements. And really the main point was the sort of SQL technologies that we have available that you can use to help meet those requirements. And of course, the more you're familiar with what technologies are available and what we have in place, then the smoother the path to compliance will be for you. And then we focused on really the kind of investments that we're making in this space. We saw an example of vulnerability assessment and data classification, and there are others as well. And we'll go into that and kind of quickly tell you about something like that in a moment. We saw how VA, vulnerability assessment, can really be sort of valuable throughout the compliance process, and that's our thinking, and investing in this is really helping you throughout that process with something that can give you this sort of centralized experience. And data classification, which of course is very important in identifying and protecting sensitive data. So all of these sort of best practices and details for kind of recommendations and how to apply built-in capabilities that can help with compliance are available in much more detail in this white paper. So this can, if you kind of want to go deeper and understand how to implement these better, then this is recommended reading. And as I said, there's one additional element, an additional feature that we're working on and that we're thinking about to help with compliance is a feature that talks about data expiration and data retention within your database systems. And my request to you is if you can help us out and actually go into this survey and let us know what type of requirements you have that can then help us develop this to really best help you in the compliance process, in the security process. So that's my ask for you for today. And just to kind of close up, really, we saw that SQL really is investing in security capabilities that can improve and champion data privacy. And this really is a Microsoft priority. What we really want to do is be able to have your database meet the highest standards of security that align with these new and stringent regulations and just generally help improve the data privacy of all of our customers in today's online world. Some more resources, if you're interested, resources on SQL security and on how Microsoft is approaching GDPR. There are a bunch of resources there that you can kind of go into more detail. A few related sessions here. I think most of these actually are in the past, but these were all very interesting sessions if you had a chance to see them. And don't forget to enter your evaluations. We can open it up for questions. Yeah.
A couple of questions for you. On the data classification side, is there any integration with the data classification in SQL Server and the other data classification labels like we see in Office 365 and Azure Information Protection?
Yeah, so that's definitely the roadmap that we're looking towards, right? Having one kind of central concept of how data is labeled and classified across the company, and the idea is to integrate with the definitions in AIP and Azure Information Protection, and then across all the Microsoft resources, there would then be one common label. So that's the plan going forward.
Gotcha. And then on the data classification in the vulnerability assessment, where you're looking for personal data, that just looking at the column names, or are you guys looking at the data itself? So, in case where people use obscure column names.
Yeah. So at this point, it's just schema-based. We're looking just at column names at this point. As we kind of get more advanced in data classification, we will probably look at subsets of data as well. But right now, it's only column names, and that also means that it depends only on the size of the schema in terms of the performance, and not on the size of the database.
Gotcha, but there's an effort to look at the data itself at some point?
As part of the extended data classification, yeah, absolutely. Okay. And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and if you guys do that, or is there thinking to integrate with sort of the unified DLP to look for things like, they have great ways to detect MRNs and credit card numbers, all that kind of stuff. Are you guys looking at that avenue?
So again, as part of the sort of integrated story with how Azure Information Protection is labeling and classifying, and how they're kind of identifying. They also have, in Office 365, they also have scans that they can do to identify sensitive data. We're working together to really have kind of a common approach to that.
Okay. Yeah. Last question is a quick one. Regarding the always encrypted, how is the client key managed, and is there protection from accidental or intentional key deletion that would result in crypto deletion of the data?
So on the server side, there's management, it's actually a two-key system. There's kind of a master key and a client key.
Okay.
The client side has to manage the client side key with a key vault on that side, and then the server manages the kind of master key. And in terms of protection, again, the responsibility is sort of the management of that client key in a kind of a key vault solution.
Okay, so if the customer fails to do it right, they could potentially or they could lose access to that column.
They could, because the server doesn't have access to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you pull the data from the report itself? Like, what are the export methods? Is there any, or if there are APIs that I could connect to leverage the data that's getting pulled for
the assessment report?
Yes.
So I talked about how you actually configure storage where the report is saved, and it's saved as kind of a JSON, file. Mm-hmm. So you can just basically connect, read that file, and then analyze it in whatever system you'd like to analyze it.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
This GDPR compliance is reaching out another data services like Cosmos DB, data lakes, will be something that will extend to other Azure data services? So
there are elements of security across all the services. I think for kind of SQL relational databases, there's more investment in security. They're kind of coming up from behind there. If you're asking about actual GDPR compliant solutions, so we're investing in sort of security capabilities that can help, but they're not GDPR compliant solutions, right? So there isn't, not in SQL nor in the other data tier kind of applications, there aren't kind of compliant solutions. In terms of security, though, they're investing more also. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
I think I kind of got an idea from the previous question, but is there a way to aggregate the information from multiple databases and multiple servers in a domain on the vulnerability assessment?
So again, this is currently being released in preview. the initial version looks at kind of one database at a time, and we're not doing an aggregation yet. It's something that potentially you could do by kind of reading reports, but we're not doing that at this point. That is very clearly on our roadmap to have kind of an all-up assessment, even integrated into Azure Security Center, so that it's an all-up assessment on not only your database environment, but also on your entire sort of Azure infrastructure and even hybrid infrastructure. So this keeps going as soon as we kind of continue the investment in this area. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about right to be forgotten.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you're working on to help redact personal data in databases?
So there is that expiration and retention feature, which isn't exactly sort of an on-demand, okay, right now erase everything or have it obfuscated initially, but it's something at least along the lines of not keeping that data around endlessly. So that's one element. In terms of actual obfuscation within the database system, we're not working on a specific capability in that area. Normally, your actual production data can't really be redacted within that system, right? That's something you want to kind of, if it's flowing to other places, to telemetry, to other kind of directions, then that's where you want it to be redacted. And we have the capabilities, such as masking, that can do that as the data kind of leaves the database. But we're not investing in any specific thing. If you have kind of requirements and ideas, we'll be glad to hear them.
It's something I've heard talked about sort of a few times.
What's that?
Sorry. It's something I've heard talked about a few times at conferences and things,
Yeah.
and it doesn't seem like anybody's figured it out yet, but
How to do that. It's a tough problem.
thanks.
Yeah, so with all this stuff, you know, you have to kind of take a look, you know, look across the entire application stack, right? So certainly the application has to support all this, but then you also have to figure out, okay, you know, what within the database is going to make this easier and not have to kind of rewrite entire applications to do that. So if anyone has any good ideas, I'm open to hearing them. And again, you know, the concept is that we're investing in this, so if we have good ideas that can really help, let us know. Yeah.
For a company like Microsoft, that's a US-based company, has a database, I'm sure, inside the borders that has data about European employees, is that data subject to GDPR?
It is.
How do they
Any data that we
enforce
have
that?
about any EU citizen, whether they're employees, whether they're customers, any data that you have in touch that's related to any person in the EU is subject to GDPR.
So how are they going to enforce that?
So first of all, you know, Microsoft has been working for years on kind of trying to track where data goes and keep track of identities and do kind of e-discovery. And we're building on that now and doing a lot of work within the company to make sure that we can meet all of those requirements.
I can speak to that a little bit. Actually, the requirements for the GDPR are not new. So we already have a privacy program in place that even before the GDPR was today, you go today and get reports on all the data we have about you if you go to our privacy program. And that'll be the way to get our customers, you know, submit a data subject request.
Yeah.
But I think you asked about how the EU are going to enforce it if you're going to the US. Two ways. One, if you have any operations in the EU, they will sue you there if you're not compliant. Two, any company in the EU that deals with you had a legal obligation to have a contract with you that says that you will comply. So this is why, I mean, I'm based in the EU, I'm talking to all of my service providers over here now to get them to sign new contracts with me to say they will comply. If I don't do that, I'm going to be liable with the EU.
So in that context, what does May 2018, the D-Day mean actually? Can you elaborate?
Yes, as long as you technically no, sorry. Actually,
No, go ahead, please do, Franz.
yes, you can. Sorry, I've been doing this more recently. Yes, you can. As long as you seem to be going in the right direction and they're not going to stack it out. But if you seem to be not caring, they're going to laugh at it.
So do you have to be compliant by May 2018, or you can start thinking and doing some stuff?
You know, Microsoft has committed to be fully compliant by May 2018. and it goes into effect in May 2018. So what does that mean? Does that mean that everything has to be completely perfect and like there's no chance you'll have a data breach and no chance that any personal data request won't be able to be 100% fulfilled by that time? Probably not, but you do need to take measures, and if something does happen and you get audited and there are no measures in place, then you might be in trouble.
So has this been done in any of the internal groups of Microsoft yet?
The GDPR compliance, we're working very hard on it. It's being done every day.
No, I mean, I was just wondering if there was a group that successfully did this and if there are some contacts where we can share some knowledge.
So that's exactly what our approach is actually, is to try to share the knowledge from what we're learning from our experience. What we're figuring out as we go along, if you look at the sort of GDPR resources that we publish on the GDPR sites, it's actually including those insights that we're kind of discovering as we go along. So that's definitely the approach that we're taking, is to try to help you based on what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. Yeah.
We've invested tens of thousands of man hours into this, and we actually already published. We haven't published specific GDPR guidance, but GDPR is just one of many things we comply with. So like ISO and NIST, et cetera. We publish the controls that we adhere to and that our customers need to worry about publicly at the Service Trust portal. So if you haven't seen that yet, if you want to get an idea of what this might entail, you can actually bring the control companions or download the control companions from Service Trust for ISO today and NIST and FedRAMP. GDPR is going to ship in product, and there's a feature coming called Compliance Manager, which that is the foundation for it. So it'll expose all the controls that we take care of, such as the security of the building and all the stuff that only Microsoft does for the cloud services, as well as customers' controls. And this is the basis of incredible amount of money spent and time spent developing this very robust control framework. And that's one of the ways we're exposing it to customers in a meaningful way. And that, I believe, it's shown this week at Ignite, but I believe that will go into preview in November, so you can start playing with it. And it is not only for Office 365 customers. I mean, it's most directly applicable to Office 365, Azure EMS, but anyone could use it. Obviously, someone who doesn't have those services won't get the technology integration, but they'll see all the controls, and they can even map their own controls, their own frameworks. So it looks like a very nice feature. And it's one way we're trying to help the customers with this problem.
Yep.
One follow-up regarding the right to be forgotten. Do you have anything in place for temporal tables to achieve that? I mean, a temporal table by design, I can delete the record, but it will not go away.
Yeah, so we don't have something specific in that area. It's something that kind of you need to figure out how to manage at this point. There are all sorts of things that are hard to figure out. Okay, if there's this requirement here and this is doing this way, then how do I work through that? There's nothing specific that we're looking at with temporal tables.
Okay. So the least thing that I would expect to see at some point is to get a way of saying, I want to hard delete the record, even in a temporal table.
You want to do what, sorry?
I want to hard delete a record. So really say this record needs to go down, out, and even out of history.
Yeah.
Because right now I can't even disable temporal to make it go away for everyone. So there's no way to get rid of the data at all.
So that kind of input actually would be really useful in the survey that I asked you about, the kind of data, retention, deletion, expiration. Take the survey, write that in there. That's input that we can use. Okay?
Okay, very nice presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Overview.
Thank you.
I've got a question about this threat detection.
Yes.
What kind of checks are these?
So
I log on 1,000 times in a second. That might be.
Yeah. So we have a few different sort of categories of things we're looking for. One is kind of potential SQL injection attacks based on patterns of SQL injection. One is a potential brute force attack based on kind of login patterns that are heavy and unusual and failing passwords and that kind of thing. We also look for access from unusual locations. So if your database is always being accessed by certain locations and suddenly we see something anomalous, that's something we take a look at. Did I miss one?
We enriched as we
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And will that be available on-premise as well?
So for now, it's an Azure SQL Database and data warehouse on-premise, not at this time.
And for the managed instance that is coming.
And for managed instance, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
One last thing.
Sure.
For this vulnerability assessment thingy in on-premise, is there any way to get this saved into a database so that I can actually build this together, get the results in a database and update from there?
To save it in your database itself?
Not specifically in the one you scanned, but to give a central database where I can push all the assessments in so that I can do something with it afterwards. Yeah. So as I was saying before, currently you're able to scan a single database, you have a report on a single database. And again, this is the initial kind of version of the feature to kind of give you, the value on a single database. As we progress, the idea will be that we'll take the results, whether it's from Azure SQL databases or on-premise databases, take those results all in some centrally managed sort of location and give you, kind of aggregations that you can do there and manage everything from sort of one central place. That's the roadmap. Yeah, but please make sure that this central location is not specifically in Azure, because for my on-premise databases, I don't want that data.
You can't have that data in Azure. No, right now for the single one, yeah, but for the centralized location, that's... If
the centralized location is then the only option I have to put it in blob.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to get into this preview if possible.
Yeah, sure. So you can kind of shoot me a mail. I can give you my card. You're interested, and be happy to get you on board. Thanks, everyone. Yep.